Hey everybody, it's Ian. Welcome back to Introduction to Folklore, and this week we're talking about children's folklore. Um, you can imagine that children's folklore has often and always been a dynamic part of the study of folklore for two reasons. One is that um, soon after things like the Brothers Grimm editions came out, the Kinder und Hausmärchen, there was developed this concept that this was um, a lore that was directed towards children. The Kinder, the child, as in kindergarten, the childhood and household tales, Kinder und Hausmärchen, and it coincided with this like long 19th century project of really inventing childhood, by which is meant reconceiving the childhood as this sort of special, sacred, encased time where children needed to be protected, not simply from the actual dangers of the world, but from dangerous ideas. It's a time of like inculcation of values. It's a time of keeping them innocent as long as one can. And you want to think about like how other things that really cemented over the 19th century developed that, like how Christmas became focused on the family, the home, and particularly the child. That's not self-evident within the holiday. I mean, yes, it focuses on the sacred narrative behind it focuses on birth and on an infant, but there's no reason why Christmas should be as infantilized as it is. Why we should be really thinking of it as this sort of home holiday. But it's because it became tied up with this sort of sacred childhood idea. And then the sacred childhood idea sort of gets extended in the 20th century, really with the creation of the teenager as this additional social category, where again they were what defines the teenager is being as yet to be an adult and extending as a different form of dependency and a different form of still needing to be protected, that gets extended onto people up until the age of 18. And the sort of and I mean the invention of teenagerhood. I don't know why I started talking about this, but this is kind of fascinating. The invention of teenagerdom as a sort of special category is related to the idea of keeping people in schools until the age of 18 or so, and like the development of secondary education. You ever think why they call it secondary? Was in part the noble idea of an educated population is a good thing, and then it was weirdly proposed and supported by labor unions who didn't want young people coming in and being able to undercut jobs. So it's like, oh no, you should still be in school until you're 18, was basically so that you wouldn't go into the factory and be a more lucrative employee as far as the employer is concerned. So it's like, no, you keep it. So even and then the legislation that sort of kind of insisted on adolescents finishing high school. I mean, there's no law, but they encourage that becomes the social norm. Is a large part about keeping people out of the workforce. But because you're keeping people out of the workforce, you have this extended liminality of the contemporary adolescent, and so you sort of create teenager, starting in the 30s and then certainly emphasized in the 50s, as this sort of special time where you have a particular status and class. So the way that adult culture defines the child, the adolescent, the university student, because we can really ask ourselves a question. I'll get back to this point later. We can really ask ourselves a question, well, where does childhood end? And then we're sort of defining what is childhood, of course. But when the definitions are coming from on top, basically anything that is not adult, you have two different dynamics. You have you have a selecting process when that group above is determining what is appropriate for children, and then you have the editing, the same editing that took place among the Brothers Grimm. Sort of, we're going to move away the sex, we're going to move away the violence, and we're going to use these tales as developing values and creating the ideal middle class German citizen, English citizen, European citizen, global citizen, whatever you want to talk about in terms of hard work and thrift, but politeness and demureness and women knowing their place and men knowing their place and all the sort of, let's just establish these categories of what constitutes something proper. And then you have these sort of periods of exclusivity. So not simply is the lore being shaped, but the what freedoms and liberties they have to exercise is determined from on top. So you have that as one of the trajectories of children's lore, because you could look at children's folklore as the folklore that children are told, the stuff that is directed towards children. And that makes sense in part because you had folklorists who, two things are important to bear in mind. They were often parents, and they remembered stuff from their own childhood. And they remembered stuff from their own childhood, and they remembered these things that were passed along. And the things that are passed along from adults and so on, you sort of get it in your head that those are the traditional. So, what gets passed down. And you should be looking at what gets passed down from parent to child for precisely those definitional things. Like, what is it that these people are saying? What is it that I am being told? Because that is going to be an informative influence. But what children's folklore does, what contemporary children's folklore does, and then starting in like the 1930s and 1950s and so on, is actually looking at the folklore that children tell each other or do with each other. The games, the stories, the efforts at meaning making, those kind of things. So the folklore of children is different from the folklore for children. And that's kind of the interesting tension dynamic. And again, folklorists, the problem is that we have all been children. Definitionally, we have all been children. And we kind of think that we remember what being a child is like, but we're looking at that from an adult model. We're looking at that from a very narrow-minded sort of development model. And what we're really doing, and one of the problems of folklore of children, but folklore in general, is how we snapped early into this sort of cultural evolutionary model. So based on Darwin, the idea of not simply do animals evolve from less complex to more complex beings that have gone through stages of sort of a greatest adaptability and suitability, and then we sort of put certain animals higher up in sort of an evolutionary change as being superior to other animals. We're better than apes. I don't know if we are, but we make that logic. It's perhaps a subjective category, but we also then we sort of think of that in terms of the evolutionary model, the social evolutionary model, where we start off in this level of, I believe the term is primitive, and then we go through savagery or barbarism, and then we enter into sort of the modern, and you can see quickly how much that is just a guidebook for justifying colonial attitudes. It's like, well, these people don't have a printing press and gunpowder, so it is part of our moral code to bring them in. And what we have is we have this sort of this dualism that takes place where we are thinking, again, I'm using the we in terms of just project yourself into the terrible mindset of the 19th century, where we are thinking that this population is in a lesser developmental stage and they need to be brought forward for their own benefit, need to be brought forward into our kind of culture. So there's an enculturation. Nevertheless, we can see their practices as evidence of an earlier genetic, the equivalent of an earlier sort of genetic heritage. And then we also see, those are the same practices that we kind of see echoed in folk culture, where we think of folklore as like this remnants from this pre-civilized time. Similarly, we have that projected onto children, and that children are just this sort of pre-evolutionary model, that but basically they are adults in potency, and that's all that their culture is or ought to be. But ironically, it's within children's culture that we nevertheless can see this remarkable time depth of practice. But and this is the dangerous parallel, is that we infantilize other cultures. They're just this lesser stage of development. They're like children. Their entire culture is like childhood. It's innocent. I mean, we romanticize that infantilization. It's innocent. It's naive. It has only a symbolic understanding of how the world operates. It doesn't have science. It doesn't have the reflective patterns of theory and all those sorts of things. And similarly, we think of childhood as the same way. Oh, it's naive. It doesn't have an deep understanding. But again, we romanticize them. And so we're infantilizing other cultures, and we're sort of looking at children as savages or uncivilized or whatever, and that becomes embedded in our models. But then we look at actual children. We look at children and the games that they play and the games that they actually play, the things that are actually said, and more importantly, how they are in use. We look at them as performances. So they're not just texts. They are texts that are brought back in, re-performed in the same way that we've been talking the entire time about what actually comprises folklore, is these things that are often based in precedent. If not necessarily the specific text, then a kind of text or a set of expectations for the creation of a new text, and then they are instanced at a specific moment and a specific time because they are considered appropriate. First and foremost, they can be fun. They can be fun, and they can be fun because they are fun. They can be fun because they remind us of things, and that's sufficient, and so on. We don't always have to be hunting for functional explanations for things. But they also allow play. And what is play? And play is again fun, but play is the temporary suspension of normal, everyday expectations and the arbitrary taking up of a new set of rules. What is a game? I mean, there's nothing in a game except for rules. And that here is what you do. And you have a completely pointless, well, no, it is. I mean, if you think of like a game of soccer or something, I need to take this ball and get it over into that net. Meanwhile, with the help of my friends, there's going to be an equally matched set of people who are going to stop me from doing that, and moreover, try and get the ball into this net that is mine. Fun. Let's make it fun. Let's not use our hands. And why? Well, it's why because it is just this temporary suspension. There's nothing stopping you from picking up the ball except for the fact that we've all agreed not to, and that's what stops you from doing so. And then you are engaged just in a different order. You are engaged in a kind of interaction that announces itself, literally in terms of there's whistles being blown, and it's timed, and figuratively in terms of it is a kind of performance. It's a kind of play. And so, yes, a set of expectations. So what comprises a soccer game is not much different, and they are regulated. Everyone is basically very much the same, except for how it becomes executed. Then you see exemplary performances, and you see less exemplary ones, and so on. But every game is basically just that. But it is, other games like The Floor is Lava, or 7 Minutes in Heaven, or any of these things that can get played are often just because they are a new set of rules, they draw attention to the normal, everyday set of rules. So they involve risk, they involve a different apprehension of things. And so we think of things like kissing games. We think of things like daring games. We think of things like Truth or Dare, for example, where either we sort of transcend these things about secrets or we engage in an act that we wouldn't normally engage in. It is these. It functions, I hate to say function, but it functions as these opportunities for at least reflecting on how we present ourselves in regular time. And children do this as well. And children are one of the things that children's folklore scholars recognize is the activities that children, even from a very young age, the activities that children find fascinating are the ones that are precisely about playing, testing these categories, trying to understand these categories that have been presented to them, that they are fundamentally expected to operate within. So the idea that there is a lot of interest in children's games about gender, and particularly the gender binary, because that is, until very recently, that is the model that has been set forward. And so like the division between girls and boys, the boy definitions, the girl definitions, the girls' understanding of boys, the boys' understanding of girls, the separation in the schoolyard, but also the occasional blending. All of this is, in a way, I don't want to say practice, because again, it sort of puts it into this functional aspect, but it's operating within the context of these are how things are being presented to us. I am now expected to be a young girl with the anticipation that eventually I'll be a young woman with the anticipation that eventually I'll be an old woman. And okay. And so you are both learning and you are trying to figure things out. The other cool thing about the study of children's folklore is that it is really bounded around the concept of friendship. And we tend to sort of think of these categories of lore often almost by default associated with families, and then by extension, ethnicity, and sort of those sort of social categories. But if you think about what friendship comprises, friendship is one of the very first folk groups that you enter into, that you aren't born into. You enter into it, and all of a sudden, it's like you didn't know each other, and then you know each other. Now, obviously, there are certain exceptions, and there's people who are, who don't remember not knowing each other, neighbors, and so on. But often, it's a matter of I didn't know this person, and I know this person. So they become these little micro aspects of the formation of groups. Now, presumably, precisely because you are within the confines of parental supervision, you aren't finding people from radically far away. They are neighbors. They are people who you go to schools with, and schools are almost by definition defined in terms of geographic proximity, and geographic proximity almost by definition implies a fairly thick set of common references. It doesn't require, but often implies shared language. It doesn't require, but it often implies some kind of shared history, at least in terms of the very basic history of this is where the cool corner store is, and do you remember that storm that happened last year, and those sort of like the micro histories, as it were. But it's then points of commonality, points of communion. Is like we are buds, but you enter into these groups. The really fascinating thing, one of the fascinating things about children's folklore is that it is passed along by children, and you will see elders. It might be strange to think of an 8-year-old as an elder, but if you have sort of a neighborhood group, and maybe these don't exist in the 21st century as much as they did even in like the late 20th, and certainly not in the sort of gilded age of child ethnography in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Nevertheless, you sort of think of these groups that get to childhood neighborhood groups where there is someone who's just a little bit older who has gone through the same kind of process, was once 5 and is now 8. And they kind of know the things, and they communicate these games, they communicate these plays, they communicate these stories, they communicate these contemporary legends and so on. They communicate these sort of real sort of discrete things, and they happen, and they communicate them in part because, without necessarily framing them as having function and value, because what kind of 8-year-old speaks like that? This is something that you need to know, because this, either as a point of information in terms of contemporary legend, or in terms of like a game, like this is a fun game because you get to kiss people, or this is a fun game because you get to run around, or this is a fun game because you get to temporarily rag on someone, but they're still part of your gang, and so it gets just passed down in that way, and it's really kind of fascinating. And that's when you start unpacking, and the themes that I just mentioned, the themes that are kind of fascinating, gender being one of them, the tension between child and adult is another, fascination with order and disorder, chaos becomes quite an interesting category, and that's one of the ways that parody enters in, and the way that children love parodies, and they kind of like puns, and they kind of like riddles, because you have something that has double meaning. You have the ambiguity of meaning, and you have the idea that there's a text, and then but there's a reference text, and so things aren't as strictly monodirectional as they might have been presented, and there's this kind of level of chaos. One of the appeals of Sesame Street when it came out was that it did parody so well, in that it took basically it took the landscape of adult television and reframed it by using concepts of monsters, which are already like this, the presence of the supernatural and the presence of the unreal within the real, and making fun of the conventions of received culture, making fun of news, making fun of commercials, making fun of masterpiece theater, and making fun of all these of all these things that are presented almost as self-evident goods, and then you get to see other people who are, I mean, clearly Sesame Street is made by adults, but they are almost like, on the screen the monsters become like avatar, and the puppets become avatars for childhood and children. It's like they are playing with stuff, and they're playing with stuff in a kind of dangerous way. I've written about the use of Little Red Riding Hood in children's television, and like how Little Red Riding Hood is evoked in Sesame Street over its history, and the way that they assume that you already know the text because it's such a common piece of folklore. And it's a common piece of folklore, it's a common piece of children's literature, it's part of the de facto North American canon, so they never actually have to perform the entire thing. They never tell you Little Red Riding Hood from beginning to end, but they can just take snippets of it and they can subvert it in these fascinating ways, knowing that the person at the other end, even if they're only 18 months old, kind of knows what's going on, and they bring you in that way. But when they bring you in by dismantling a text, man, it's like all of a sudden, like Kermit is interviewing the wolf, and the wolf is like has no idea what to do, and like, well, maybe you should dress up as the granny. Damn! I mean, all of a sudden, these things that are presented to us as de facto from parents' culture, oh, here is a fairy tale, is the idea that things can be messed with and played with, and that nothing is cast in stone is kind of a fascinating aspect. Children are also, with all that idea of play, children are also incredibly conservative. They like the pattern that has been presented before, and you see that. I don't think I'm confusing the issue by talking about sort of the parent aspect, but children are very obsessed with the idea of something being done right. Like, that's not the rules, and that's not what happens. So even though they are interested in dynamism, they are also very interested in conservatism, that this is the way it ought to be done. And again, from a parental perspective, that idea of like, if you tell a story differently from the way you told it before, you are in for some kind of berating from your child. That's not how it goes. And that's okay. Just remembering that conservatism is an aesthetic that people put on things. So children's folklore exists in the various associations that one has as a child. Again, you can start with a family and siblings as a group, an extended family, and then the people in the street, people on your road if you have neighbors, and those sort of friendship groups. And then at schools, and the age stratification that tends to take place in schools, and that becomes an interesting dynamic, because in sort of cherished communities, or sort of classic communities of up until the mid 20th century, neighborhood groups would often be larger. It would be more both sexes would be present. You would all genders would be represented, but within the context of still a regimented idea of binary. And the age group might be quite far-ranging. Schools stratify by age, and the one-room schoolhouse is one thing, but once you get into sort of the contemporary urban North American school, and you have grades, and you tend to kind of regiment. The grade 4s don't play with the grade 3s anymore, and so on. So you have that kind of stratification, and that stratification is, again, one of those things that's kind of imposed by structures, and yet then become adhered to by children. So it's an interesting dynamic that we need to remember, that these groups exist. As much as I am emphasizing that they are creative, that they have dynamism, that they are clearly, they don't know as much as adults, but that doesn't mean that they are any less intelligent than adults, and they are making, even if they can't articulate it in the same way, they are making similar kinds of choices, but the similar kind of choices that they make are within contexts of limited liberties, because they are restricted to precisely how far they can roam, and precisely how much economic liberty they have, let alone, they can't go for road trips and all the sort of things that eventually happen later in adolescence. And even, as I said, when do we stop talking about childhood? Because there are arguments to be made that adolescent folklore can really benefit from thinking of it within the same methodological parameters that we use for children's folklore. And an argument can be made that student folklore, university folklore in particular, can nevertheless benefit from the insights of the study of children's folklore. Obviously, you are dealing with greater and greater and greater liberties, and greater complexity of influence. Again, not necessarily raw intelligence, but more and more exposure to things that become conditions, but also potential symbols and potential motifs for performance. You have the same impulse of creating something that is antithetical, because you do have that child-adult tension, whether it's a child adult, whether it's an adolescent adult, whether it is a university student and quote-unquote adult, without suggesting that university students are not adults. They are defined in part antithetically, or at least oppositionally to a different sort of order, as it were, or a different caste, a different generation. Maybe then just leave it at that. And that often is something that's imposed upon them, in that students are the same thing as that university students are infantilized. So once we infantilize university students, then university students can best be understood through these processes. But they're engaged in play. They have the ability to sort of the liberty of being able to still investigate these categories, investigate the categories that the most privileged, the most dominant, the most powerful culture sets as the expectations. Oh, this is good. you start with children, you go for an adolescence, and it's still present in university, where it is those opportunities to test and challenge and adhere to, or completely subvert those, that sort of, again, that thick normativity of dominant, fully adult culture, in the last gasp before you actually enter into it and become sort of a generator of it. Yeah, that's kind of cool. Yeah, that's the thought. So children's literature, children's folklore. Just remember that it is these things, like all folklore, things that operate within groups, that circulate within groups, circulate and continue to circulate because they are considered important, because they are considered relevant, because they are considered apt, because they are considered to help meet expectations. Fun is present, and they continue to be fun. But you want to ask why a particular text. And it can't be because children are really interested in continuing stories about how people survived the plague through the use of nosegays. That's just ridiculous. But the idea of falling down for fun, or playing with ideas of death, and while singing, the juxtaposition of singing and death, that's kind of fascinating. That's kind of morbid. Kids love morbid. Kids love body parts. Kids love, the abject. Kids love ridiculousness. Kids love fart jokes. And in part, it's because they know they shouldn't. And who's saying that they shouldn't? Well, here we go. And so that level of play, that level of the sort of the dominant mode, in part because, they can. They can. And they are being told how they are going to have to be as they enter into this sort of final stage of adulthood. And they're like, do I? Okay. And maybe most of the time they are earnestly working towards that. But a lot of the culture is about, really? Really? And the older kids, not the adults, but the older kids are saying, this is the stuff that you need to know. This is basically how you're going to navigate. And I like it. So we want to distinguish between the folklore that children tell each other, that exists within child groups, and the folklore that we are now using to the adults direct towards children. You can think of it, again, this is a strange parallel, but once I mention it, if you go back to look at the occupational folk life versus the organizational folklore thing, where you have the canon of work technique, the culture of the workplace, that what constitutes a good worker, the things that you need to know in order to be effective, versus organizational folk life, where you take these sort of cultural forms, parties, pranks, going away, retirement parties, all sorts of things, and you turn that into something. It's like, I'm going to make this a happy work. The management turns that into something. I'm going to make this a happy workplace. And that's kind of the distinction. That this is a way of trying to bend this culture. Folklore directed towards children is a way of trying to bend the people who comprise this folk group in the way that is best suited for adult concerns. In the same way that our organizational folklore is about the best way it is for management concerns. And children's folklore, as the children practice it, is equivalent to occupational folk life, and that it's what you need to know in order to actually get through this and to be good at doing this, irrespective of what adults say. Oh, this is fun. Okay, the reading this week is by Evelyn Osborne, and it's about a kissing game in Newfoundland, and the memories of this kissing game by adults. And one of the last things, we always talk, we sort of have this, as much as I always lament, or always resent actually, talking about how there are certain aspects of folk culture that are disappearing or dying because of technology and so on. Say, no, folk culture is alive and vibrant and so on. I think the last thing, it goes back to my idea, it goes back to the things I was talking about at the very beginning, is that with this invention of childhood as this protected state, with this invention of the sort of, the sacrality of childhood, we have entered into, perhaps starting in the 70s, but increasingly so, having this protection be keeping the child almost entirely under some kind of supervision within the home, within not playing in the streets. We have had stranger danger basically inform our entire understanding of childhood, that the child is fundamentally a victim in potency, so they need to be kept safe. And again, that does not dismiss the idea that there is actual danger that is associated with childhood and that there aren't potentially monsters out there. But because of that, many of the dynamics of this sort of gilded age of children's folklore really have kind of disappeared, or they exist in the schoolyard and very little outside of that, because children don't play in the same way. And that is, on one hand, old man talking. It's like, children don't do what they did in my time. But that is also an observation. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't be creative. They live lives online, and now we stranger danger that as well. And again, often, sometimes justly. But, how do they have these outlets for pushing back at the strictures that a dominant culture is trying to place upon them? And not pushing back in terms of rejecting, but pushing back in terms of testing. It's like, is this so? Are boys made of puppy dog tails? Let's see. Where does that take place? All right. So back to Evelyn's reading. It's looking at it's adults. It's her aunt and her sister, her aunt and her mother, who are looking back at this children's kissing game in an outport in Newfoundland, and what its long-term repercussions are for them as adults, and this dynamic between not simply being nostalgic, but recognizing that these texts are more than simply aesthetic texts, that they were doing something. And what were they doing? And the question of the week is basically, again, reflective. And can you describe a children's game or activity, something, piece of lore from your own childhood? And describe it in as much thick detail as you want. And you can start to try and articulate themes that might have emerged from it in terms of, this is basically about gender, or this is basically about something else. Or it could be hopscotch, where hopscotch isn't necessarily about, hopscotch is a perfect example of a game in terms of an arbitrary set of rules. It's like, you got to throw a stone and you got to jump on it. It's like, okay. But it doesn't necessarily have some kind of deep symbolic meaning. Anyway, so describe something from your childhood. Question of the week. All right. Go away. I'm Ian. Be well, and I will talk to you later. Bye.